Welcome to the CPA Advisory Show. I am Jeremy Wells, CPA, and with me is my co-host, Chris Hervochon, CPA. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Jeremy.
All right, we are going to kick this thing off by asking a question, what does CAS mean to you, or really what does it mean to us? This is probably one of the biggest sort of inside baseball debates going on in the field right now is what do those three letters actually stand for? What all is included with that? What should we be doing for our clients to give them better experiences, better service? We're definitely going to dive into all of that. Before we do that, since this is our first episode, we want to introduce ourselves. So first of all, Chris, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit for our listeners?
Sure. So I am Chris Hervochon. I run a small firm based in Hilton Head, South Carolina. We've got an international team. We're basically all over the place. And we provide CAS services, virtual CFO services to marketing and creative agencies primarily. And our client base is all over the U.S. Been doing this for about 10 years in right now, 4 years full time. One of those deals that started with a side hustle. How about you, Jeremy?
I am Jeremy Wells, CPA, also an enrolled agent. I was an enrolled agent since 2018 and still have that designation. But for the last couple months now, I've also been a CPA, just passed the exams last year and added that license as well. I also run a small CAS and tax firm called Wells CFO. We've been doing tax and bookkeeping and payroll, mostly for small S corporations. A few partnerships, a couple of corporations, and a lot of freelancers and independent contractors, solopreneurs, that type. I've been doing that since early 2018. Before that, I was not an accountant. I was in higher ed. And so this whole accounting thing, I've been in it a little over 4 years now, and it's all still brand new to me. So I'm still trying to figure it out. And that's part of my personal purpose with this podcast, is to kind of get some of these ideas out of my head, some of these ideas and thoughts. But that's me and my firm. So for today's topic, what is CAS? Chris, start us off. What do those three letters mean for you?
It's a good question. We don't actually use three letters in our firm. What we use is four, and it's Cloud Accounting and Advisory Services. So CAAS as opposed to CAS. But we really went through an effort about a month ago to define exactly what CAS is, what it means to us. And if you do some research, it basically means a lot of things to a lot of people. It's CAS, which could be client accounting services. It's CAS, which could be client advisory services. It's CAS, which could be cloud accounting services. It could be outsourced accounting. It could be virtual CFO. It could be write-up in some cases, but it's all over the map. But the way that we define it is CAAS, cloud accounting and advisory services. The cloud really enables everything that we do, and making sure that we're doing the advisory in there as well, which is really what drives all the value. What about you? How do you guys define that?
Yeah, so the first breakdown of that acronym I came across was probably client accounting services. And then, of course, like you said, I've heard all the rest of them too. It almost should be probably like 5 or 6 letters, like you're saying, because it's, and I don't know if that's because the concept itself has creeped out to include all these different things, or if just from the beginning it included all of these things and different people brought different assumptions about what was necessary and therefore what was inherent within that. And so we don't need to include it in the actual acronym itself. And so you're right, the focus on cloud is definitely part of it. The 21st century has made so much of this more possible to scale, especially for smaller firms, than would have been possible 20, 30, 40 years. On top of that, the focus on the client, though, is also necessary because it shifts the focus from a traditional professional services firm, where the focus is on the professional as the expert, the service provider, the one actually doing all of the heavy lifting. And now with this focus on the client, we're trying to do a lot of the work and the heavy lifting for the clients for sure, and the technical work. But at the same time, this isn't a passive operation for the client, right? The client is really at the center of all this, both in terms of we're trying to help them, but also we need a lot from them. If we're going to do more work for them, we need more input from them as well. So to me, if you compare it to the 1040 shop down the road, where it's mostly just a transactional kind of setup where the client just drops their stuff off, 2 weeks later, they come back, they pick up their return, and they're done. And so it's relatively light load and light interaction with the client. With CAS, the way we're going to talk about it and the way we are talking about it, the client it has a lot more active stake in what's going on. And so they need to be part of a significant part of the equation.
So when you say client, it sounds to me like what you're really saying is advisory.
And that's actually the next bullet point. And that's my next question is, so you're saying accounting and advisory. And when you look at CAS being discussed and where people try to come up with a breakdown for that acronym, it's usually either client or cloud, accounting services versus advisory services. So what then is the difference between accounting and advisory? Can we be doing accounting and not advise? Can we be doing advisory and not accounting? Are they just different ways of saying the same thing? What's going on there with accounting versus?
It's a good question. When you're doing the accounting, yeah, you can do it without doing the advisory. You basically just do the books and then deliver them, and then you're done. So accounting is over, and then that's where it ends. That's basically where the relationship and where the helpfulness ends. When we're talking about advisory, the way that we think about it is just be helpful. It's not necessarily a whole bucket of things that we do. Yeah, we market it that way and we talk about it that way. And there are things that we do on some sort of cadence like budgeting or forecasting. But when it comes to advisory, really the nuts and bolts of it are just be helpful. And actually one thing that really helped shape my thinking around that was this book called Getting Naked. And it's a business fable. It's a great read. Anybody who's in the advisory space, I definitely recommend it. But the basic nuts and bolts of that book and the message of that book are just be helpful. And it's a great marketing tool, and it's a great way to drive value to your client, which is really the only thing that matters when we're talking about advisory. So yes, there is the accounting piece. Yes, there is the advisory piece. They go well together. And the way that we deliver our services, we need to have that accounting piece. So we have good, accurate numbers on a timely basis that we can then do the advisory piece on the back.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. Like I said, before I came into accounting, I was actually in higher education, and the number of similarities, like the overlap in how we think about our role in the overall purpose of the industry, the mission, whatever, there's a lot of similarity there, because in higher ed, we would talk about the professors who saw themselves as the sage on the stage, and they would just, they would come into the lecture hall, and you anywhere from 30 to maybe 800 students, right, filling up this lecture hall, this auditorium. They would go up to the front, they pull up their slideshow, they would talk for 45 minutes or 80 minutes or however long that class was supposed to meet for. They'd get done, they would shut down their presentation, and they would leave. And they had done their job. They had come in, they had imparted wisdom, they had done their job as a professor, and then they would go do other things. And that was certainly one model. And then I think there's another model that brings in a lot of related concepts. So active learning, one-on-one consultations with students, trying to be more of a mentor or an advisor than just a professor. And there's a lot of similarity between that and the accounting industry. Are we just trying to get stuff done for our clients? Like, we're just trying to get tax returns done? Are we just trying to get the monthly close done? Or are we actually trying to use all of that work product and those deliverables and actually help the client as an individual? In higher ed, I always saw it as herding cattle, because I was at a big state university. And it felt like the goal at the departmental level or the college level was to just get many students from coming in to graduation as possible, right? Matriculation rates and retention rates. That's all anybody cared about. That was the leading key performance indicator or whatever. And, you know, it feels like when we see a lot of accountants talking about tax season, for example, right? Like, how many tax returns have you done by the deadline? How many tax returns did you have to put on extension? How many new clients did we have come in this year? How many returning clients did we have? And it's a lot of just like moving numbers around. And those are important, but then that misses a whole other set of ways of thinking about the relationship of that one-on-one relationship. And so it's not to say that quality is sacrificed or anything here, because you can set your firm up to do 800, 1,200, 2,000 tax returns every tax season and get them done correctly. But then on the flip side of that, it may not be the best outcome on an individual client level to set your firm up that way. It's important to say that you and I have set our firms up in certain ways, and in some ways very similar ways, but it's not to say that there's a right or a wrong. There are sacrifices, there are trade-offs.
For sure.
And so when it comes to this question of advisory, yeah, I always saw my role in higher education as focusing on the individual student because I went to a small liberal arts college and most of my professors thought that way too. They saw the meetings with students during office hours and going with students to conferences and these kinds of things as those opportunities to build relationships and help develop students into future members of society. And my role as an accountant, a small business advisor. The title I use changes depending on like the content in which I find myself and the people I'm having conversation with. Because sometimes I say, yeah, I'm an accountant. Sometimes I do everything to not say I'm an accountant, depending on what kind of group I'm in. And that is part of the function is thinking about who you're talking to, what your audience is, and what you're there to try to do for them. And that gets back to that advisor role.
You've drawn a really interesting comparison between the CPA delivering services to their clients or the accountant delivering services to their clients and the professor at a university. So most probably everybody who's listening to this podcast has gone to a 4-year institution because they're probably a CPA. And everybody's had that experience with a professor that kind of just checks in and checks out, shows up, does a lecture, gives an assignment out, and then that's pretty much it. Whereas most people probably also have this relationship either in college or in high school where they had somebody who was really a true mentor and helped to walk them through the education process and really imparted knowledge as opposed to just information to get memorized for an exam. And that's basically the difference between a great professor and an advisor and a mentor and, you know, a great accountant and an advisor. It's just the forum has changed where we're talking about education versus small business. So that's a great comparison. That's something that's relatable to pretty much everybody.
Yeah, I did not come into the field with the experience of a lot of accountants and CPAs. Right? I didn't know that I wanted to do that right off the bat. So I didn't go into college and a graduate program thinking I want to be an accountant and therefore I need to do all the things that my potential employer is going to want me to do. So I need to try to compete for the internships and get hired on by a big regional or national firm or all those kinds of things. And so I need to play the part that they want me to.
And it's got to be audit. It's got to be audit in the Big Four. Otherwise, you can't be successful in this profession.
It was a pretty unreal experience studying for audit for the CPA exams when I had never done any audit work. And I knew I was 99% certain I'm never going to do any audit work. But yeah, this is what the license is for, to allow us to do audit work. But still, which is a whole other conversation for later about what the CPA license really is and where that's going and all that stuff. But yeah, I absolutely think so. And as a personal side note there, the CPA license itself really doesn't have, as far as the license and what the license allows us to do, right? It doesn't have a lot to do with advising clients. It certainly doesn't have anything to do with doing tax returns, but that's the work that matters to the clients. And because of the public perception of the license, it makes it to where prospective and current clients are just naturally going to look at us as more capable advisors and more trustworthy advisors because we're CPAs. And so someone who wants to get that license to get the marketing and reputational value of the CPA, they're trying to set themselves up to be seen as an advisor, or hopefully they should be, right? Hopefully they're seeing that as something because that trustworthiness and that market value of the license that feeds into, it lends itself to advisory. So when we talk about advisory, that could be a really big term. On one hand, we're sitting there talking to clients, trying to help them think about their businesses, their personal finances, their taxes. What are we really talking about with advisory? What does that look like on a day-to-day basis? What does that look like in terms of what we're actually doing for clients, what they're actually paying us to do?
It's a big area and it's a big topic for sure. The way that we think about it holistically is just be helpful. But what does that mean? It can mean a whole lot of things. You got an email from a client 2 days ago. Hey, Chris, I've got $70 in my bank account. How do I make payroll on? I don't know. Let's talk about it. And then so we sit down, schedule a meeting next day, and here's a dozen ideas on how we can get some cash in the bank account to make payroll on Friday. That's being helpful. How do we think about pricing? Sit down, talk about pricing. How do we become more profitable? Having those conversations, that's being helpful. What do I do around strategy for the business? Where am I looking long term? Two of the things that our clients get a lot of value from, and it's a low bar, but that's one of the things that we have to get past as CPAs, where we think that everything's super complicated, and it's not. The bar to being helpful is low, and those two things are cash flow forecasting and budgeting. Those are two things that our clients find to be extremely helpful, and things that are generally nebulous. It's actually your term, but a lot of our clients are accidental entrepreneurs, and they just fall into it. Like I just fell into it. I had a side hustle and now I've got a firm. So I don't think that we need to make it as complicated as we try to make it sometimes. It's just a matter of being helpful, and that looks different for everybody. And just realize that a lot of our clients, don't have expertise running a business, and they need help everywhere. It doesn't have to be everything that we do, but they need help everywhere. So just realize that we can move it from 0 to 1 as opposed to 5 to 10.
When you say just be helpful, I agree. A lot of accountants and professionals writ large would hear that and immediately start thinking about scope creep, unbillable time, unpaid work.
I see where you're going.
And these are conversations that I'm not sure if it's quite a hill I'm ready to die on, but it's conversations that I probably a little too aggressively get into, especially in social media. And so I have never billed for time. Again, I wasn't brought up into accounting the traditional way, right? So I've never kept a timesheet. I've never sent an invoice with hours on it. And it's never even occurred to me.
Then how do you know if you're profitable? And that's a tongue-in-cheek question.
Conversation for a future episode, right? Yeah, absolutely. I get invoices. I get bills that I have to pay. We have a plumber come out to fix a leak, and then there's the $100 for the parts plus the $100 for them spending 15 minutes tapping on things and tightening things to fix the leak. And to me, it's always seemed a bit strange, but I never really thought about it until, and it wasn't even when I first got into this field. It took a while. It took a couple years of being set up in this way where I was just charging clients a fixed monthly amount for doing whatever work was in the agreement that I would do for them. And that seemed natural to me. I come from the subscription generation with Netflix. I pay Netflix a certain amount each month, and they let me watch the movies that they have available. Would I like for them to have more movies available? Sure. Is there a whole bunch of stuff on there that I scroll through that I'll never watch? Of course. And I run my firm the same way. I have clients who probably think this guy is doing a lot of stuff for me and I don't really understand why. And then on the flip side, they might be saying, I asked this guy to do something for me and he tells me that he can't do it and I need to go talk to somebody else for it. And that's natural, right? Because again, we're licensed to do specific things, and some of those things I can't do. Some things I built my firm saying I just won't do. I won't do sales tax in my firm, for example.
Yeah, I hear that.
It's just something that I tried it with one client. It failed miserably. Partly my fault, partly the client's fault, but it failed miserably, and I'll never do that again. Right? That to me, that just makes sense. And so the advisory part of that just naturally fits in, right? If you're paying me and we're on this model where as long as you're paying me, I consider you a client, then I'm going to do what is going to be most helpful of keeping you as the client wanting to be part of that relationship. And how do I do that? Like you said, I'd be helpful.
Right. So let me ask you this. Do you meet with your clients on a regular basis?
The ones that want to, sure. So okay. I have some clients where I schedule regular meetings, and I have some clients where I just make a Calendly link available to them whenever they need it.
So we're basically the same way. So here's a way to be helpful. Here's some actionable tips for somebody who might be listening. Proactively reach out to your clients and ask them if there's anything that they would like to talk to you about, or just reach out and just say, how are you doing? Start there. But when you actually meet with people, just ask them what's not going well, how can we be most helpful, and then go from there. And then you can figure out later whether or not there's scope creep, or whether or not there's things that you can help with. And if there's things that you just can't help with because you can't do it well, then refer that out and get yourself some referral partners. But if there's things that you can do and can do well, either think about wrapping those into the subscription or the fixed fee or recurring retainer, whatever you want to call it, service that you're offering to that client, or think about doing it as a separate engagement. And that's one way to capture that value while also being helpful and making sure that the client feels like they've been heard.
I love that. Advisory lends itself to that proactive approach, right?
For sure.
Because if we're constantly waiting for the client to come to us with their problems, concerns, issues, and we're constantly just reacting to that, we're always putting out fires. And a lot of the discussion with the IRS being slow to respond, and deadlines have been shifted over the last few years because of the pandemic. But this year it stayed at April 15th, and so we need to change the deadline. I'm not disagreeing with some of those arguments, but at the same time, a lot of that conversation seems to come from this place of feeling like we're constantly putting out fires. And sometimes those fires are questions and emails and calls from our clients. Sometimes those fires are tax returns that have new things added to them we weren't trained to think about. Crypto, for example, right? And so you can constantly be in this and not even fully aware of it, but constantly be in this putting out fires kind of mentality. And when you get into that mode, you're no longer really doing advisory. This is back to what we were saying about accounting versus advisory. Is bookkeeping is reactive. Bookkeeping is looking into the past. Bookkeeping is what happened last month or last year, as opposed to accounting or advisory, which is thinking about, okay, now we know the past numbers. Like you said, with budgeting and forecasting, where do we want to take these numbers? What are we trying to achieve with these numbers? And for example, looking at how you run the tax side of your practice are you also doing tax planning, tax meetings, estimated payments, right? Those kinds of things where, yes, getting last year's tax return done is a lot of work, and there is cause for celebration when you hit the deadline or when you file those returns. But at the same time, if you wait until a year later, and we say the same things to our clients, don't wait until April to figure out your tax return from last year. Let's be figuring it out this year. But then inside of our own practices, it's very difficult to get into that mentality of not always trying to be figuring out last year. And so we don't leave ourselves enough time and capacity to focus on the present and the near future.
Yeah, the tax return that shows up on April 1st and they say, hey, do what you can so I don't have to pay anything. And the write-up work that shows up at the end of the year, those are basically the same things. It's work that needs to get done, and you have to deliver a service, but there's an opportunity there for advisory, which is the tax planning, saying, hey, look, it is what it is at this point. It's April 1st, and maybe we get you on some sort of monthly plan. Maybe we do some tax planning throughout the year, and then we can address these for this year going into next year before they become this fire drill that it is right now. It's the same thing on the write-up work. Like, hey, I've got to do the same amount of work to do your accounting as I would if I did it every single month. And now I can't really provide you with any advice to affect these numbers. They are what they are, or what they're going to be. And maybe we get you on some sort of a monthly plan where we can discuss this on an ongoing basis and help you to move your business forward throughout the course of the year, as opposed to this fire drill that we're going to have at the end of the year.
Getting out of that putting out fires and fire drill mentality is really the first step. Seeing that it doesn't have to be that way. I also see a lot of accountants, though, say, and I hear them say this, that it's almost like a rush. They get off on the putting out fires mentality. It's just 3 or 4 months. If I put in 70, 80-hour weeks for 4 months, and I get the other 8 or 9 months of the year off, and that's great. I don't agree with that. I would much rather. I'm more of a slow burn kind of person. I would rather jog for 45 minutes or an hour than sprint for 10 or 15 minutes. And I try to run my firm the same way. I would rather be doing work throughout the year for a limited number of clients as opposed to 3 or 4 months worth of work for more clients. And part of that is just because of the way I'm built. But the other part of that is because that, to me, puts me in a position to be more helpful to clients.
It's just a preference. You want to work really hard for a short period of time and make as much money as you want and not do advisory. It makes it very hard when you're just cranking out 1040s to do that advisory type work. Or do you want to be that advisor and help people move their businesses forward and be helpful throughout the course of the year? It's just a preference and how you want to run your firm and what you want to get out of it.
There's obviously a lot of issues around this, and we brought up a bunch of them. The rest of this show, at least for the foreseeable future, is going to be focusing on these kinds of issues, these related issues. And we're obviously taking a perspective here that's based on our experiences running our own firms, which is all I've ever known. The only part of accounting I've known is running my own firm. I briefly worked for another firm, but even then I was still working with my own clients. Chris, you've had experience working for others a little bit more than I have, but so obviously there's some limitations on what we're thinking of. But at the same time, we're actually here in the lab doing work. This isn't theoretical for us. This is trying to not only build firms and our businesses, but supporting our families with what's going on here. I try to spin up a new service that is going to be good for my clients and help them. And so I invest time and probably some money into some education or training or credentials or something to be able to spin up that service, and it flops. Nobody wants it. That's food off my kid's table if that doesn't work. And so there's definitely a perspective that we're going to bring here. But we're going to use some guides here. There's a lot of discussion out there about CAS and what does CAS mean and what's included in CAS and how should your firm provide CAS services and all this kind of stuff. But I definitely think these kinds of conversations coming from these experiences is going to be good for other accountants out there, maybe aspiring accountants, ones that are just coming out of their bachelor's or master's programs. Maybe they're still debating whether or not to get the license or a license. Even some of these side hustle bookkeeping firms that are getting started, or tax prep firms. And so there's going to be a lot of people out there that are interested in what the possibilities are, what it's going to take if they're interested in offering these kinds of services, and where they can maybe even improve on what is already out there and being said and discussed about CAS. If somebody came up to you right now and said, I've heard about this CAS thing, I want to try to be helpful to clients, but I'm just getting started, what's the first thing you would say to them? Where would you tell them to start?
That's a tough question. It depends on the background that you're coming from. The background that I came out of was corporate accounting. Yeah, I've got a little bit of public experience, but not really in the CAS realm. It was in forensic accounting. It depends on the background that you're coming from. If you're coming from a firm, another public firm, and you're starting the CAS practice, take a look at what they did, and then take a look at the gaps that you think that there are in delivering value to the client, and then just change that, and then just iterate. The whole thing is iterative. We can't even agree on a definition of what CAS is, but we know that it's going to be around for a while. There's people that are doing it. People are interested in it. There's surveys out there that say that it's very profitable. The CPA is pushing it. So it's going to be around for a while. But again, we can't even agree on a definition. It's certainly left up to interpretation, and it's going to be iterative. So start somewhere. You can even just start with bookkeeping and layer on the back of bookkeeping questions to clients, or just learn how to take a deeper dive into your clients' books and start to ask questions and point things out to a client in a meaningful way. That's where you can start, and then you can build from there. But my message would be, it's just going to be iterative, and nobody's got to figure it out, and that's okay. So long as we're being helpful to the client, it's going to be different for every firm. It's going to be different for every client. It's going to be different for everybody. Don't stress about it. Just start.
Definitely agree with that. I started slightly differently. I came in, when I knew I wanted to come into accounting from higher ed, I started reaching out to CPAs, accountants, found one. He became my mentor, and I really just copied his practice. He set me up with basically a carbon copy of what he was doing. Flat monthly fee, a relatively limited scope engagement, but that was unlimited in terms of time. So as long as you keep paying, as long as you want to maintain this relationship, then we'll keep it going. The scope of the agreement was focused primarily on tax services and doing tax prep, tax planning, some tax advisory, and I started offering bookkeeping as an add-on to that, because I was working with a lot of S corporations, and S corporation owners are notorious for not keeping good records of what they're doing. And that lent into thinking about, okay, so if I'm doing the tax returns, and that's what sort of gets them in the door, they want to save on taxes. In order to do that, they need the S corporation. If they're going to have an S corporation, they need to do some administrative stuff. So I'll try to upsell them with bookkeeping, but I was still setting them up through a payroll service to do their own payroll. Again, this is an opportunity to say, you know what, this is some more admin stuff that you don't need to be worrying about. And honestly, as the professional, I would rather you let me do it and take care of it for you. And so I just started finding sort of those, what started off and seemed like ancillary services, and were actually the core of what makes this work. And the more I was doing that, the more frustrated I realized I was getting with constantly trying to clients to these additional services, to where I finally said, look, if I'm going to be helpful to you the way I know I can be most helpful, it's going to require that I do X, Y, and Z for you. And I began just started thinking in terms of, these are all of the things that I have to provide to you as a package, and you can't pick and choose. This is not, a fast food menu. This is a set of professional services that if you want some sort of desired outcome, then you got to let me do all these things. But it took a couple years of, working with clients, trying to upsell those services, figuring out which services were necessary, figuring out which services I wanted to provide, and then finally getting to the point to where, that's the way I'm running my firm now. And if we come back in 2 or 3 years and I go back over what services I'm offering and how I'm labeling them and packaging them, it'll probably all be different then too. So definitely, to your point on the iteration, at first, like you said, you've got to imitate, maybe write out copy, find somebody that you look up to that you think is successful, and just imitate what they're doing. And then figure out what part of that works for you, what part doesn't work, what goes along with that you need to include in order to feel like you're truly being helpful. And then just go from there.
For sure. Jeremy, we've got a few minutes left. Give me something tactical. How do you migrate a 1040 client? So let's just say, for instance, because there's people out there listening who have this situation, how do you migrate somebody from 1040 to S Corp to CAS? What's that conversation look like? What are the questions that you're asking? How do you approach that?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of these clients because I don't take on 1040 only clients anymore, but I do have a few clients that are in this position or have recently been through this with me. And so it's normally looking like somebody that comes to me as a real estate agent or an independent contractor. And so they've got some income reported on a 1099 and NEC or miscellaneous, depending on how far back this was. So they've got a Schedule C, and I'm noticing in the first year or two that I'm doing their 1040 that the profit on that Schedule C is going up and up. And I live in Florida. I've got a few clients in Florida. Also looking at the state income tax situation. Does an S Corp make sense? And then I'll just reach out to them and I'll say, or they'll usually notice when I send them that 1040 with some substantial self-employment tax. And I'll just let them know. I'll be like, hey, look, I know this seems like a lot of tax, and you're probably thinking my job is to keep your tax bill low. And over the last couple of years, I've been doing your 1040. It just seems to keep going up. It's because you're making more money, but you're making that money in a certain way that's going to make your tax bill keep going up and up. And we can not necessarily bring that all the way down, but we can head that off a little bit. Let's have a conversation. And then that'll turn into the conversation where we'll talk about the S corporation. And I just lay it all out on the line. I tell them, I can do this for you, and it will save you this percentage generally. I try to keep it in very general terms, but give them an idea. And I also put it in terms where they have to do the math in their head. I don't want to start throwing out numbers and seeming like I'm just pulling these numbers out of a hat, or that I'm setting myself up to commit to specific numbers. But I'll give them rough percentages, let them do the math in their head. And then I'll tell them, in order to get to that, there's a checklist of things we need to do. And if they don't have an LLC yet, I'll start talking about that, then talking about what the S corporation is and the various admin things we need to do to not only set up, but also maintain the S corp. And then I tell them, I do all of this for you, or I do none of it for you. You go find somebody else, right? It's up to you. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And not everybody wants to do it that way. You can still be a good advisor and not do those things. Like you said, you have that strong referral network. If you've got a good bookkeeper you like to refer people to, if you're comfortable setting up your clients on Gusto and passively monitoring that for them, that's fine too. I don't like to do that. I like to be the one pulling and pushing on the levers for my clients. That's what that conversation looks like, and that's how I try to make that transition.
Very cool. I love that. So we are at time. If we were just going to wrap this up with a couple of key takeaways, it sounds like be helpful. Start somewhere, be iterative. What else? Mentorship
was the key for me.
Yeah.
So if this is what you want to do, or you're pretty sure, you don't have to know for certain. Don't waste somebody's time. I started reaching out in the spring when I thought I wanted to be an accountant. And so I was reaching out to a lot of CPAs in February and March. And then I didn't know that was a problem. Now I realize why that was pretty dumb.
Yep. Perfect.
But And so I wasn't getting much of a response. But when I was reaching out a little bit later in the year, May or June, I started getting a lot of responses and I started talking to a lot of them. And I really started to hit it off with one. And that turned into what became and what still is what was a really successful mentorship. Aside from the loving support of my wife, the one thing that made all of this possible for me. And so that has always been my strongest recommendation to anybody wanting to get into this field is find a good mentor. And they're hard to find. You got to just keep talking to people, keep asking people, just let them know what you want to do.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's actually how this podcast started almost, right? Or to some extent.
Absolutely.
I mean, hey, look, Tiger Woods has a coach. You should have a coach too. And it's okay to have a coach.
Absolutely.
You can't do it all yourself. It takes a village.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll talk more about CAS later in future episodes and start breaking down some of these topics, but looking forward to it. So this has been Chris Hervochon and Jeremy Wells with the CPA Advisory Show. Thanks for listening.